Thanks so much to all of y'all for making some time this evening. My name is Max Colley. I'm the program manager for public engagement with science at the Museum of Life and Science here in Durham, North Carolina. I'm joined this evening by my friend and colleague, Dr. Vivek Shandas. I'll give him a chance to introduce himself and give a better introduction to his body of work here in just a few minutes. Before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about our webinar this evening and about the project that it is in support of. So this summer, perhaps some of you have joined us before for some of our HeatWatch mini seminars, of which this is the third and final. This summer, this webinar series is in support of a large partnership and project that is aiming to monitor heat expression across roughly 130 square miles here in Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina. This is a broad partnership between many different organizations, neighborhood associations, community living groups, churches, things like that. And I suspect that many of y'all that are on this call this evening may be a part of at least one of those groups. So preemptively, and before our date where we set out to monitor heat expression, thank you so much for your participation, and we hope you're enjoying so far the engagement and education and edification that our esteemed guests have been able to provide to us thus far. I'm very excited to that end that we are joined this evening by Dr. Shandas, by Vivek, who can help us learn more about perhaps some of the methodology behind this, some of his adjacent work, and then also give us a broader national scope and scale of what this project is like. But essentially, the Museum of Life and Science, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, Activate Good, Durham County, the City of Raleigh, and State Climate Office of North Carolina and the National Weather Service's Raleigh office have all been really key central partners in this broad group of partners aiming to set out to do this work with the essential and important goal of trying to better understand how heat is expressed across urban landscapes. And I'm sure that tonight's mini seminar will be important as to helping us figure out why a study like this is so important. I guess without too much further ado, Vivek, if you feel ready, I will pass it on to you and let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work.
Okay, thanks, Max. I am trying to get my video started, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty figuring out why that's the case. I can see myself in my own system, but I don't know why. Interesting. But I will keep fiddling away. But thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here. I'm delighted that you're all partnering on this heat campaign and all the interesting results that I think will emerge, as you'll see. And so much of what matters with the heat campaign, there we go. So much of what matters with the heat campaign is about what you're doing right now, like the engagement that's happening. So happy to participate in this micro seminar and just kind of talk shop casually, kind of get into it in a little more detail if you'd like. Needless to say, like I'm in the Pacific Northwest and we just had this heat dome event here, and it was just a rude awakening in more ways than one, because temperatures were about 30 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than their average here at this time of year. It broke records by orders of magnitude in terms of any historic event that's ever happened, by almost 5 or 6 degrees in terms of what it is that we've seen in the Pacific Northwest. So, I mean, it really felt like something serious has just kind of shifted for a lot of us. And so this has gotten us really thinking a little bit about what are we doing for preparing? How are we doing this? While the Southeast may have heat events that come through regularly, and as well as droughts and other climate-induced challenges, there are myriad things that still can be done. And I think that's part of what the heat campaign is attempting to help put your creativity, your engagement, and of course, ultimately the actions into place to be able to get some relief from some of the hottest heat waves that I think we'll have ever experienced on the planet. And that's what we had here with 100 and the official record was 115, but we do a lot of campaign monitoring. So I took the sensors out and clocked in a couple of neighborhoods at about 124. Fahrenheit. And that is not what any of the plants here are evolved to be able to withstand. So we were watching several limb failures. We were watching lots of um, uh, streets buckling, infrastructure. We were watching cables, literally cables that are moving electrons and electricity melting, and all kinds of really unusual things were emerging in this region over the last few days. So I'm just coming out of that. I don't have AC. Many of us don't have AC. It's not like I don't have a job and I can't afford it or anything. I do have a job, and I do have a way to pay for AC, but we've never had to use it. Like, it doesn't get above 100 degrees, but maybe once or twice a year. And so these kinds of events really got us going. And our family just ended up getting the first AC for the bedroom, first time ever, just last week in preparation for this heat wave. So all of us were huddled up in the bedroom over the last 4 days, pretty much. And so that's all context, kind of thinking about where I'm coming from right now. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about maybe your heat campaign, put that into context, talk a little bit about the implications of it, and then certainly about the future. But as Max was saying, please feel free to jump into the chat with any questions or comments that you might have. I don't want to be the only one talking, so Max, I want to lean on you for just kind of maybe probing and going on a little bit about what might be relevant for you all.
Yeah, sure thing. A little behind the scenes here in the Raleigh-Durham context for this project, our really excellent partners at the National Weather Service's Raleigh office have been helping us with short and long-term forecasting to find the right conditions for the campaign date for us to go out and monitor what heat looks like on a hot day. The trouble that we're having here is the exact opposite that you are having there. The Southeast is pretty well known for having a lot of really high heat days. But while you are up there absolutely sweltering and perhaps clocking the 3rd or 5th highest temperature in a major US city this week, we are experiencing like really excellent mild temperatures that are unseasonably pleasant for the Southeast here. I wonder if you can speak a little bit as to why. So we've done some of these about a local context, but I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about why a sort of national, broader context like this is so important. Why is this happening in 20, 24, 25 cities concurrently this summer? And what is it that you're hoping to sort of piece together with all of that?
Sure. Yeah. And we have a few international campaigns too going, which is super interesting, in South Africa, in Canada and Latin America. And part of what we're attempting to do is, when we see the news, and when we see, this is actually very recent experience for me too, with this heat wave coming through the Northwest. When we see the news, we see this one monolithic number for an entire region. Sometimes maybe for Raleigh-Durham, you'd see 3, 4 numbers that represent temperature and what, even with humidity, what the heat index might feel like when you're out and about. And part of what we're trying to do is kind of break this idea of, the city itself is hotter than, or the metro region is hotter than its surrounding areas, that kind of conventional notion of an urban heat island. And we're wanting to get into the little bit more of an invisible perspective of what is it that's actually happening in the streets, and what's happening in the neighborhoods. Because frankly, when I hear one number for the city of Portland or the city of Seattle, the city of Raleigh, city of Durham, it's like, I really can't do anything about it. That's just Mother Nature at work. It's going to send a big old pulse of hot air towards me, and I'm just going to have to cope with it. And when we start getting a bit more granular with the description of heat, like what you all are doing, we can actually see that we have some agency in this process of determining what our neighborhoods, what our streets, what our households would experience in terms of exposure to heat. And so when you see this one number, it's like, meh, yeah, we're hotter than the surrounding area. No big deal. We got to just cope. But when we start seeing that difference in one neighborhood versus the other, we start asking, why are those differences so profound? We're seeing 15 degrees difference, for example, where you have 110 degree Fahrenheit day in one place. It's, like we saw 125 in other parts of the same region or in the same neighborhood, in the same city. And when we simply ask the profound question of why, then we get into this whole deep conversation of what does it mean to have created our cities in a way and designed our cities in a way that has been ignorant to the effects of heat on human health and well-being. We have no design standards, no code from the American Society for Civil Engineers that tells us our buildings need to be a certain way to ameliorate heat, as one example amongst many other things like, you know, fire. We deal a lot with fire in the West Coast, and our HVAC systems are not equipped to deal with the amount of particulate matter in the air right now. And so there's a whole other set of like building design and maintenance and operation features that aren't set up for dealing and coping with this kind of these kinds of stresses that we're seeing. So when it comes down to like, why do we see these differences? It has a lot to do with what decisions and what considerations were put in place and by the people who are in power to make those decisions about who gets to live in an area that's cooler, who gets to live in an area that's hotter, or who has to live in an area that's hotter. And so we start getting into socio-demographic questions, we start getting into pre-existing health condition questions, and then we start getting into like infrastructure and like the types of materials that are used and the amount of greening that a place has, the coloring of the materials, the ability of those materials to absorb heat and hold on to it and then re-radiate it back out into the buildings often. So that geometry and the age of buildings, those things really matter. And we see those play out in these heat campaigns. We really see them play out, and it gets us hopefully one day that the great weather service folks you're working with will say, hey, it's going to be 100 degrees today Fahrenheit, and guess what? X, Y, and Z neighborhoods are going to be 112 degrees and 114 degrees and 117 degrees. And we might want to be really looking out for our neighbors in those specific zip codes or in those specific neighborhoods or even on those specific streets. So the granular data you're collecting will help us move to that direction of being able to safeguard our cities from some of these acute heat waves.
Yeah, that's great. A really excellent question came in from one of the chats. You all have done this type of study in cities over the past couple of years. And you might be loath to talk about results that are still forthcoming from this year's Raleigh-Durham campaign. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the patterns that have so far emerged in the cities that you've done it before, perhaps regarding some of the questions of geography that you've done a great job of talking about, but also along the sort of demographics and patterns of who are the people so far that you have found get to live in cooler places, to put it, have to live in hotter places.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, the physical environment is one thing where we could talk about the infrastructure. Then you get into these demographic questions, which are really at the core of a lot of our concerns, because the people who die from heat waves and the people who have some severe health related impacts from heat waves are remarkably predictable. Like it is largely lower income folks who cannot, who don't have AC or can't run AC. It's folks who are marginalized from decision-making processes and have been for a long time, such as Black, African-American, Indigenous, as well as other communities of color that have been either deliberately prevented from being able to move into certain neighborhoods because of covenants, racial covenants, or because of bigger national policies like redlining and race-based segregation policies. These have all lend itself to these very enduring patterns that we're seeing of where intergenerational poverty exists in a particular city. Like we see some neighborhoods where, regardless of what decade you're looking at it, the level of poverty and the level of access to resources remains relatively low in terms, or the access to resource remains low and the level of poverty remains high over decades. And so in many ways, what these heat maps and the results from the campaigns help us to kind of hone in on are where have those decisions that have been made often without often without consulting the communities that live in the neighborhoods, where have those had the most grave effects? And so we're actually doing fundamentally, in some ways, a policy evaluation, if you will, of how well our city is doing in managing the heat in different parts of the region. And so what you're essentially able to say is, hey, we're not doing so well because we're actually seeing the same systemic patterns that we've observed in many other regions. And I'm really looking forward to doing that with and for you all in the Raleigh-Durham area.
Yeah, and your analysis there really ties in really well to a couple of questions that have just come in, which all sort of are along the lines of what is to be done. We are in the process of collecting and better understanding new scientific knowledge together. What are the implications of that, and what do we do with it? So what have you seen so far in places where this type of work happened before that you think was effective? What do we know works? Conversely, what do we know perhaps doesn't work or is not effective at mitigating some of the really negative effects of heat in urban environments?
That's really good. That's where we go with this. So, I spent most of my time in grad school looking at like satellite imagery and trying to interpret land patterns with satellite imagery. And so when the question of like effectiveness and what you can do about it comes up, I used to be of the mindset anyway, and I feel like I've really gone through a little bit of a transformation in the last few years of with these heat campaigns. It's really affected the way I think about solutions, and and it has to a lot to do with how do you engage in the questions, how do you engage in the problems that we're trying to address. And I often engaged with those problems through a pretty deep technical assessment of satellite imagery, of trying to understand kind of reflectance bands and trying to understand emissivity ratios and really getting into a pretty technical aspect that was very hard to communicate clearly and effectively with broad audiences who may not have even thought about heat as an area of study, let alone like something we're trying to program and solve around. And so with these heat campaigns, I really started getting more into the question of like, what does it mean to engage the communities who live in the place and who actually have experienced the lived experience of a hot day and what they've done to cope? And how is it we can engage communities in such a way that these data sets then can be interpreted, collected by communities, and then interpreted by them, and understanding patterns as to why these patterns may exist locally, and really allowing that process to unfold more, I don't know, more locally and more in a community-based approach. And why folks like, the museums that, Max, the museum that you work for, as well as the other informal science museums that have been part of these campaigns have been really instrumental in our ability to engage communities, as well as like interpret and tell this broader story about what are the solutions that we can really think about together. And so the solutions that have really been coming up have been largely based on the communities that have been involved. In Las Cruces, for example, there was people involved that were very interested in transportation projects. And so what ended up happening was they identified areas that were really hot. This is the Southwest. They looked at shelters for bus stops, and they looked at very modest things. I mean, it's not like these are very expensive. There's already projects happening, and they just kind of layered in, how do you create a shelter in a bus stop that actually is facing, oriented in a way that the sun wouldn't directly be hitting the people waiting there. There were other projects that thought about greening campaigns in specific parts of LA, for example, Los Angeles, where historically there had been no greening in those areas. And like, how do you tear up the concrete and actually bring a little chicane or other small green spaces during a project? There have been other projects in Jackson, Mississippi, where we did a campaign last year where they actually worked with our HeatWatch data and then went to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and got $500,000 to start implementing revisions to specific corridors where school children are walking and biking to school where there's no sidewalks even next to high schools and junior high schools and elementary schools. So they've taken this money and identified places where they could actually start thinking about interventions very strategically. There's been other programs that have been looking at public health interventions and what might be simple things. Again, some big projects you could think about. Though the ones that really capture my attention are the low cost effective ones, like the simple thing of creating block parties where the city has been encouraging neighborhoods to get permits for blocking off the road so neighbors get to know one another. And so if there is a heat wave, you know who to look out for. And maybe there's a neighbor who might not be able, might be an older adult who might not have access to a lot of cooling resource, might not be able to have access to AC or walk to the cooling or drive to the cooling stations at the Public Health Bureau. And so these kinds of like small interventions that have proven in many parts of the world to be very effective. And so the interventions are really about what the local context and what is the appetite for local community members, community-based organizations, and planning and public health agencies, urban forestry groups to kind of move on. And so it really varies by place. I've noticed there's no one size fits all, certainly for any of these kind of solutions.
Well, I think that's a great answer because it can feel overwhelming and almost like a sense of helplessness at how huge this problem is. You know, some of the questions that we get related to this project have been, what am I supposed to do? What am I, a member of the public, a resident of X neighborhood? What is there that I'm supposed to do since I do not decide policy? I do not do urban planning. I am not sitting at these sort of heights of power where perhaps we perceive of a lot of these decisions necessarily needing to be made. You know, I think it's true that there are policy and planning implications for all of these things. And so getting involved in creating political will seems like a good, you know, one step of piece of advice. But I wonder, given your expertise and your wealth of experience in this field, you know, what advice would you have for somebody who's asking, you know, what am I supposed to do about this?
Yeah, as somebody who's constantly asking kind of where my place is in this bigger field, like urban heat is a really big field. And I mean, it's as simple as things, you know, we just moved from a southeast part of town to northeast part of town. And it was really interesting. We're in a part of town that's undergoing lots of change. And one of the things a neighbor across the street said was that this street 20 years ago had absolutely no trees. Like it was a treeless landscape. And what she has been doing consistently over the last 20 years is getting opportunities for planting trees right along this corridor of 16th Avenue on which I live. And it was amazing. And I looked at some satellite imagery because I have access to that stuff, high resolution satellite imagery over time. And she's absolutely right. This street over the last 20 years has greened up. And it's been largely in part because of one person, Julie, who lives across the street, who has been just tenacious in her interest in wanting to green up the neighborhood. And she's done a fabulous job at engaging the people in the neighborhood and thinking about what trees they would prefer. Some people wanted cherries because they like eating cherries. Some people wanted like locusts because they're very drought tolerant. And some people wanted old kind of iconic Douglas fir trees. And so they really allowed this like tailoring of a project, but it was all tree based and along this one street. And I think those kinds of ideas and projects that happen at the local level really capture my imagination and allow the opportunity for people to engage in a conversation that's not like capital H heat, but like capital C, you know, or capital L local, and trying to really think about what are the things that inspire you. And Julie just happens to really love trees. And so that was the thing that she found to be helpful. And there's others who love education and teaching. And so I've been working with some organizations to essentially capture imagery of infrared, like curriculum. You know, we've been doing a lot of infrared cameras and kind of catch zombie apocalypse exercises where zombies don't like hot places. So where would you go in your neighborhood. If a zombie's arrived, you use the infrared camera to find those locations. And so we've done a fair bit of those kinds of small projects because I like that kind of engagement as well. So lots of things you can do depending on what your flavor of mitigation is, really.
That's great. We're almost out of time. I wanted to end by talking a little bit about the future. So here in central North Carolina, under any emission scenario, we expect to see more extreme heat days of, a variety of flavors, more days over 105, more days over 100, more days over 95, more days over 90 degrees. That I also feel scary and can also bring about a sense of hopelessness. And I wonder if you might, talk to us a little bit about what brings you some hope or what makes you excited. What would you like to see implemented, or what else needs to be further investigated? What further understanding do we need about this kind of thing? And generally, what are your thoughts about extreme heat mitigation, adaptation, resilience into the future?
Yeah, the future's the crystal ball question is always a tricky one, right? It's kind of like the thing that really gives me joy and hope is the fact that we're having this conversation and that these campaigns are actually bringing attention to. And frankly, I didn't start these campaigns because I was looking for more work. I started them because it allows me to sleep at night. Because I know these conversations, writing papers in my university day job, like writing papers and doing research and engaging students who might one day have an impact on the field is one thing, but then having immediate and direct results from some of the work has been really, it's been really joy bringing and allowing me to engage in these conversations as well as learn about how local communities are taking the context, taking the politics, taking the economics, taking the social conditions and building on those for identifying strategies for reducing heat. I've seen that happen now. It's amazing. We're actually just embarked on a project to kind of characterize what different communities are doing right now around the country based on some of these results from the heat campaigns. And that truly brings joy. And it has nothing to do with us aside from the fact that we have a little bit of equipment and we can provide a little bit of guidance at the get-go. But after that, it's all locally done, and we are getting more and more capacity to be able to support folks after the campaign with mitigation planning. So we've actually done our first few mitigation planning exercises with workshops with the city of Surrey, British Columbia, with some folks in LA, folks in Jackson, Mississippi, folks in Yonkers, New York. So we've been like doing these follow-up activities in places, which has been wonderful to see how enthusiastic, how much momentum, and all that you're doing right now, Max, with this group and with the campaign, I think is only going to pay back in spades because it really is the setup that matters for these and the kind of gravitas you bring to them with all this engagement that you're already doing.
Well, thanks so much, Vivek. I wonder if you have any closing thoughts or wisdom for us before we close this out for the evening.
Whatever you can do to get FEMA to identify heat waves as a natural hazard, I would be really excited about that. I'm trying to move that needle a lot these days. Just want FEMA to think a little more seriously about how serious heat waves are, but they're not budging right now on it. They're seeing it as not so much. They have things like, explosion as a disaster category. And they have things like drought as a disaster category. They have things like human caused as a disaster category. No pandemic or epidemic as a disaster category either, and no heat wave. So I'm thinking a lot about like, how do we get the bigger federal agencies to take this seriously and start working with the fact that we are going to be seeing more of these happen, even though you might be experiencing an idiosyncratic cooler summer right now. It's likely not going to be the long-term trend is my hunch. And so to think that there is a play at the federal level to bring more attention and resources to local communities, I think is going to be an important one.
Thank you so much for your time this evening. And thank you to everybody who joined. I like Vivek, thank you all so much for your involvement in this project. And you all are really the engine that makes this go and will be the impetus behind what comes out of it, what comes next. So thanks again for being involved, and thanks for, of course, being here this evening.
Yay. Thanks, Max.
Great.
Thanks, friends. Good luck. We'll be in
Thanks
touch.
so much. We will be in touch.
Right.
So long, everybody.
Bye.